There is a moment, often imperceptible to the world, when the soul, having endured the weight of too much feeling, too much knowing, too much seeing without being seen, recedes. It does not announce its departure. It does not rage. It does not protest. It simply folds inwards like a lantern in windless dusk, dimming not out of despair, but because it has realized something so primal, so eternal that it no longer seeks witnesses for its flame. This is the moment many empaths experience not as a crisis but as a return, not a collapse, but a crossing. And it is this moment misunderstood, often mislabeled as detachment, coldness, or avoidance, that becomes the point of departure from the world they once sought so desperately to love and heal. Why does the empath disappear? Why does the soul that once burned to connect now drift into silence without apology, without the trembling need to explain? The answer lies not in a momentary rejection, but in a mythic, archetypal shift within the psyche. The long and slow alchemical turning of pain into wisdom and of longing into solitude. What you see as withdrawal is not merely emotional fatigue. It is individuation. The empire's retreat is not abandonment of others but the reclamation of the self once fractured in the mirror of collective projection. When I speak of the empath, I do not refer to sentimentality. I speak of a deep and ancient structure of sensitivity, not just to people, but to the invisible architecture of the world, moods, silences, tensions, symbols. The empath is the psychic barometer in a family, in a relationship, in society before others know a storm is coming. The empath has already felt its pressure in their bones. But this sensitivity is not an eternal blessing unless it is tempered by consciousness. For without integration, the empath becomes a sacrificial figure, one who bleeds in service of others' comfort, who dissolves their boundaries in the name of harmony, and who mistakes self-erasure for love. And so begins the ancient cycle. The empath enters life open, receptive, hungry to heal and be healed. Yet they are often born into relational fields where such openness is not mirrored but exploited. The child who becomes the empath is often the one who had to read the room before they could read themselves. The one who sensed the parent's sadness before they even had language. And because they learned that attunement brought temporary peace, that anticipating others' needs preserved some semblance of belonging, they fused their identity with emotional labor. This is the womb of the empath's role. Not chosen but inherited, not nurtured, but necessitated. But no soul can live indefinitely in a posture of availability. Even the sea needs a shore. Even the giver must retreat. And so a rupture occurs slowly at first. Imperceptibly, it begins with subtle feelings of exhaustion, of spiritual depletion, of disillusionment, so quiet it feels like guilt. The empath notices they are no longer energized by helping. They feel hollow, resentful, unseen. They try to restore their original light through giving more, forgiving more, bending more. But the ancient law of psyche intervenes. What is not acknowledged becomes shadow. And the empath who has so long denied their anger, their unmet needs, their human limits finds themselves haunted by inexplicable dreams, mood swings, illnesses, and a longing they cannot name. This is the moment the soul begins to fracture the false self. The persona of always available begins to disintegrate. It cannot sustain the psyche's demand for wholeness. The mask of harmony becomes suffocating. And so in what appears to the outside world as a sudden decision, but is in fact the fruit of countless invisible inner battles, the empath quietly walks away, not with bitterness, not with cruelty, but with the unmistakable silence of someone who has finally remembered their original name. What others interpret as avoidance is to the empath sacred. It is the ritual of return. Return not to the external world but to the inner sanctum that was abandoned in childhood. And it is not that the empath now hates people. It is that they no longer wish to be food for others' emotional hungers. They no longer want to be the mirror, the container, the confessor. For too long, they were the vessel. And no one asked what filled them.
Le tue se not misunderstand de archetype hier.
To cut everyone off is not a sign of brokenness. It is often the first genuine act of psychic autonomy. It is a boundary drawn not in anger but in sacred necessity. And the reason they do not feel the need to return is because their departure was never about others. It was about self-initiation. They are not waiting to be begged back. They are not testing the waters of others' loyalty. They are not enacting a drama. They have simply crossed into a new psychological continent. One where solitude is not a punishment but a medicine. In this inner world, the empath begins to dismantle the ancient contracts they made with pain. They revisit the original myths they carried. If I love enough, they will stay. If I understand them, they won't hurt me. If I fix them, I will finally be safe. These were not fantasies. They were survival strategies born in powerlessness. But in the quiet of their solitude, the empath sees their illusion. And rather than shame themselves for believing it, they honor the child who had no other choice. Many have asked me, is it not selfish to cut people off? But I ask in return, is it not sacred to finally choose life? Not a life of performance, but a life of authenticity. The empath who retreats is not abandoning love. They are choosing true love, the kind that does not demand the cost of their soul. They are no longer performing emotional salvation. They are remembering that salvation begins within. In dreams, such empaths are often shown images of thresholds, doors that open to wide landscapes, forests that whisper ancient songs, oceans with no shore. These are not mere symbols. They are invitations.
The threshold is the place where the ego dissolves into the self.
The forest is the unconscious beckoning them home.
The ocean is the mystery of the soul untethered from roles.
And these dreams do not lie. They arise when the soul is ready to initiate a new phase of development from wound bearer to wisdom keeper. And perhaps the most profound aspect of this journey is this. Once the empath has truly crossed into their own center, they no longer need to explain why they left. The compulsion to justify, to narrate, to be understood, it dies. Not because they no longer care, but because they now see that trying to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding them is a form of violence against the self. They leave without a speech. They leave without a script. They leave as the moon leaves the sky at dawn, having done her work in silence, illuminating what she could. This is not detachment in the modern sense. Cold, indifferent, avoidant. No, this is sacred withdrawal. This is the gesture of the mystic, the prophet, the wounded healer who has learned that there is a time to speak and a time to become the silence itself. And in that silence, something ancient awakens. Not the desire to be needed, but the desire to be whole. Not the hunger to belong, but the knowing that they belong to the depths. Now to the self, to the eternal. They walk among you like ghosts. Yet they are more alive than ever. You may pass them on the street. Their eyes are calm, their voices soft. They are no longer entangled in the economy of validation. They are no longer bargaining with abandonment. They are simply here sovereign, whole, unreachable. Not because they are better, but because they are no longer seeking what they now know was never found in others. Only reflect it. And this is the quietest power to no longer need to return to where your soul once bled in order to prove you've healed. Healing is not a performance. It is a disappearance followed by a re-emergence on another plane. And those who try to call the empath will often find the echo.
Not the person, the cell, not the soul.
For the soul has moved on, not out of punishment, not out of pride, but because the soul knows when its chapter has ended, and it honors that ending like a priest honors the dusk. To understand the empath's disappearance is to enter the subterranean cathedral of the psyche, where echoes of ancient wounds ring against the stone walls of forgotten memory. The empath's silence is not born of arrogance nor apathy, but from the profound realization that the labyrinth they once tried to escape was not constructed by others alone, but also built by their own unconscious loyalty to suffering. In leaving, they are not merely severing ties with others. They are renouncing the architecture of codependence carved into their nervous system. And yet this renunciation is not a rageful gesture. It is solemn. It is ritualistic. It is the cutting of energetic umbilical cords that once fed them illusions of safety. You see, the empath had to learn that the longing to be understood can become a trap, a golden chain that binds them to those who benefit from their confusion. For the moment, you need someone to understand your pain. You have already made them a gatekeeper of your peace. And so the empath steps back, not because they no longer feel, but because they now feel too deeply to remain in spaces that distort their truth. What happens next is often perceived as strange to the uninitiated. The empath begins to engage in what I would call the sacred detachment. Not the coldness of defense, but the warmth of presence without enchantment. They stop trying to rescue others from their own shadows. They no longer offer explanations where none are asked in good faith. They understand now that not every relationship is meant to survive awakening. Some were built entirely on sleep. And this, I must stress, is a point of deep sorrow. The empath grieves not only lost connections, but the death of who they used to be. In those connections, they weep not just for what happened, but for the years spent hoping it could be otherwise. Their tears do not merely mark betrayal. They marked the passing of a self who tried endlessly to love in a place where love had to be earned by disappearing. But within that grief is an initiation, a baptism into a new state of being where the waters are not comfort but clarity. The psyche at this stage often dreams of ancient temples, forgotten books, strange keys in invisible locks. These are not fantasies. They are symbolic communications from the self, which has been patiently waiting for the personality to crack open to loosen its identification with suffering long enough for new symbols to enter.
The temple is the self-calling the empath home.
The book is the new mythos unwritten but already encoded in the soul. The key is the act of saying no and no that unlocks the yes of one's true path.
Do not misunderstand.
The empath still loves, but their love is now rooted in discernment. They have learned that love without discernment is not virtue. It is self-harm. They no longer pour themselves into cracked vessels hoping to be enough to seal them. They no longer enter burning houses thinking their compassion will become water. They know now some fires were lit to awaken, not to be extinguished. And in walking away they honor not only themselves but the journey of the other. For true healing cannot be done for someone, it must rise within them. There is also a deeper mystery unfolding in the empath's withdrawal.
The rediscovery of archetypal solitude. This is not loneliness.
This is the encounter with the archetype of the hermit, the seer, the exile who chooses the margins in order to commune with truth. In every culture there are tales of those who went into the desert, the cave, the mountain. Their solitude was not isolation. It was preparation. And so too for the empath, they are not gone. They are becoming in solitude. The empath begins to hear their true voice, not the voice shaped by others' needs, but the voice that speaks in symbols, in gut feelings, in dreams.
This is the return of the intuitive campus lomberit beneath the noise of survival.
And as they listen, they begin to rewrite the story they were told. The story that said they were too much, too sensitive, too emotional. They realize now these were never flaws. They were gifts misunderstood by a culture that fears depth. And as they reclaim these gifts, something remarkable happens. The need to return dissolves, not because they have shut their heart, but because their heart now recognizes resonance. They are no longer seduced by familiarity. They do not confuse comfort with connection. They no longer pursue reconciliation for its own sake. For them, the return is not to the past, but to the self, and only relationships aligned with this self are permitted entrance. Now I have spoken with many who carry this empathic structure, and they often describe the same sensation, a stillness within. Once turbulent, acquired in their bones, once filled with a noise of trying to be enough. They feel less visible to others but more present to themselves. And this too is initiation. To be unseen by the world, but finally seen by the soul, is a sacred trait. And here is the paradox. The more whole they become, the less they need to be mirrored. Their center is no longer external. They are no longer orbiting the moods and opinions of others. They are no longer tethered to the emotional tides of people who only knew how to take. Their silence is not a void. It is a CA.